You're standing in a mudbrick workshop on a hillside in eastern Turkey. It's roughly 3300 BCE, and the air tastes like scorched clay and wood smoke. In front of you, a crucible of molten copper glows orange, thick as honey, and you're waiting for it to cool enough to touch. Somewhere behind you, a dog barks at nothing, and a neighbor is arguing about a debt in a language nobody alive today can translate. There's no phone to check while it cools, just fire, a stone mold, and 3 days of waiting. For nearly 3 million years, humans and their ancestors had been shaping tools by hand. Stone flaked into blades, wood sharpened into points. Even the first copper tools, hammered into shape rather than cast, were just older ideas dressed in a shinier material. Every single edge a human being had ever carried could also feed them. Skin a hide, butcher a deer, cut a reed for a basket, split a branch for a fire. A tool was, by definition, something that helped you live. The thing cooling in front of you right now can't do any of that. It has exactly one job. Somewhere in the space between that first sharpened stone and this glowing crucible, something in human history quietly changed, and it never changed back. Archaeologists have only found a weapon like this in one place on Earth this early, and it wasn't found where you'd expect. What does it mean that the moment humans figured out how to make something purely for killing, they didn't hide it? They buried it like a trophy. For most of human history, weapons and tools were the same object wearing different hats. A stone axe split wood and skulls with equal efficiency. A flint-tipped spear killed a boar on Tuesday and cut rope on Wednesday. Even after humans discovered metal, that dual purpose didn't disappear right away. In 1991, hikers in the Alps found a 5,300-year-old man, now known as Utsi, frozen and remarkably preserved, carrying a copper axe on his belt. That axe could fell a tree. It could also, and eventually did, end a human life. Even humanity's best metal tool at the time was still, at heart, a generalist, doing whatever job the day demanded. Archaeometallurgist Neljana Radivojević and her colleagues, studying copper smelting sites in the Balkans dating back roughly 7,000 years, found some of the earliest evidence of humans deliberately extracting metal from rock, not just hammering nuggets they happened to find, but actually smelting ore into something new. It was a genuine leap forward, centuries before anyone in the region had a writing system, a wheel, or a city. And for nearly 2,000 years after that leap, nobody used the technology to make anything resembling a sword. Here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind. If humans could smelt metal thousands of years before swords appear, what took them so long? The honest answer is almost embarrassingly practical. Pure copper is soft. Soft enough that a long, thin blade will bend on the first real impact, then simply refuse to bend back into shape. Early metalworkers weren't short on imagination. They were short on chemistry. The fix took centuries to stumble into, mixing copper with a small amount of tin, or in some regions, arsenic, to create bronze, a material hard enough to hold an edge and just flexible enough not to shatter. Get the ratio wrong, even slightly, and the blade turns brittle enough to snap during the pour, let alone during a fight. Get the cooling wrong, and hairline cracks form invisibly inside the metal, waiting to fail at the worst possible moment. For a long time, casting a dagger-length blade was already pushing the limits of what anyone could reliably pull off. Casting something twice that length, without splitting it down the middle, was an entirely different problem, one that took the better part of 2,000 years to solve. You've never had to personally solve a chemistry problem just to safely open a bag of chips. Somewhere around 4,500 years ago, that was, functionally, the barrier standing between humans and their first sword. Some archaeologists initially assumed the earliest long blades in the record were just oversized daggers, and the exact line between a dagger and a sword is still argued over in academic journals today. Length alone wasn't what settled it. What convinced researchers they were looking at something new was the way the blade attached to its handle. Engineered specifically to survive a thrust without the whole weapon coming apart in your hand. The breakthrough site sits at a mound called Arslantepe in what's now eastern Turkey, the same hillside you're standing on in this story. In the early 2000s, archaeologist Marcella Frangipani and her team, excavating layers of the mound tied to one of the region's earliest complex societies, uncovered a set of blades dated to around 3300 BCE, cast from arsenical bronze, each one roughly the length of a forearm. By most archaeological definitions, they are the oldest swords ever found, predating the famous bronze weapons of Mesopotamia and Egypt by several centuries. The layer they came from also held administrative clay seals, evidence of one of the earliest known societies organized under a single centralized authority. Here's a detail almost missed in the excavation notes. When researchers examined the blades closely, they found almost none of the nicks, dents, or edge damage you'd expect from something used to kill. The obvious assumption is that a sword this early in human history must have been built for war, humanity's first dedicated killing tool, forged for the battlefield. The evidence tells a stranger story. Arslantepe wasn't a battlefield. It was one of the earliest known complex, centralized settlements in the region, something closer to a proto-palace than a war camp, with storerooms, administrative seals, and signs of an emerging ruling class. The swords weren't found scattered near skeletons with cut marks. They were found stored together, deliberately, in a building tied to that emerging political authority, alongside objects historians associate with ceremony rather than combat. The first sword wasn't primarily a weapon for killing people. It was a weapon for showing you could. It would take another 1,500 years for the sword to grow into the role we now assume it always had. By the time bronze swords spread across the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean, somewhere between 1700 and 1200 BCE, they'd become longer, better balanced, and, for the first time, genuinely built for a fight. Within a few centuries, researchers have traced strikingly similar bronze blades appearing independently as far apart as Scandinavia and early dynastic China, each culture arriving, on its own, at nearly the same solution to the same casting problem. Archaeologist Barry Malloy, at University College Dublin, spent years studying something almost nobody had thought to look at closely: the microscopic wear patterns left on the edges of surviving Mycenaean swords. By recreating swordsmanship with faithful bronze replicas, and comparing the resulting damage to the ancient blades under magnification, his research found these weapons weren't being swung wildly. The wear patterns matched deliberate, trained combat technique, parries, targeted cuts, specific striking angles, repeated consistently enough to leave a signature. Someone, 3,500 years ago, was teaching people how to fight with these things. There was a system. There was a curriculum in everything but name, which means somewhere in the Bronze Age. Warrior had already become something closer to a profession than a role you filled once and forgot. Here's where it gets interesting. This is the actual moment the sword becomes something no object had ever been before. A spear could still be thrown at a boar. An axe could still fell a tree. Even in war, most weapons kept 1 foot in ordinary life. But a well-made bronze sword, built the way Malloy's research describes, is bad at almost every job except one. Poorly shaped for chopping wood, useless for skinning game efficiently, too fragile and too expensive to risk on farm work. Its entire design, from the taper of the blade to the weight in the grip, exists to solve exactly one problem: another human being at close range trying to solve the same problem back. No other object in the human toolkit up to that point had ever been built with only one possible use. Specialization is usually something we praise in tools, a sign of progress. Here, the thing being specialized for was killing another person more efficiently than a spear, an axe, or a fist ever could. Remember that 3-day wait for the crucible to cool back in Arslan-Tepe? The kettle you complained about earlier boils water in 90 seconds. That blade took days to cast, and even then it might crack the first time someone actually swung it in anger. Ancient smiths burned an almost unreasonable amount of time and risk into an object with exactly one use. That's not a small decision. That's a society deciding a single-purpose killing tool was worth the cost. Here's the thing. Nobody tells you about what happened next. Bronze swords stayed rare, expensive, and mostly in the hands of elites for centuries, not unlike the ceremonial blades back at Arslan-Tepe. A farmer couldn't just decide to own one. That changed with iron. Historians studying the Hittite kingdom, including scholar Trevor Bryce, have traced how ironworking technology, spreading out of Anatolia and the wider Near East by around 1200 BCE, gradually made blades cheaper to produce and easier to repair than their bronze predecessors, since iron ore was far more common in the ground than tin ever was. For the first time, a sword wasn't only a symbol of who already held power. It became a tool. Ordinary soldiers, not just elites, could be handed, which meant armies could suddenly be equipped by the thousand instead of the dozen. What started as a single ceremonial object stored in a proto-palace on a hillside in Turkey had, within 2,000 years, become common enough to hand to a farmer's son on his way to a war he never chose. Somewhere in that long walk from a soft copper trinket to a mass-produced iron sidearm, we crossed a line as a species that no other tool-making animal on Earth has ever crossed. We didn't just learn to make things that could kill. Every predator on the planet already carries that. We learned to design something whose only purpose was killing our own kind, and then we kept refining it for thousands of years, the same patient way we refined the plow or the wheel. We didn't stumble into that specialization by accident. We built toward it, on purpose, one bronze failure at a time, generation after generation, until purpose-built violence became a technology like any other, taught, improved, and passed down. The crucible is still cooling in that mudbrick workshop. In a few hours, someone will pull a blade out of that mold that can't plant a single seed, can't cut a single reed, can't feed a single person. Nothing else on that hillside was made the same way, and they will consider that a successful day's work. That trade, usefulness for purpose, is one we never really walked back.